A very warm welcome indeed to the Art Workers Guild. Can I just check everyone's warm enough this evening? We can turn the heating up if anyone's cold. My name is Ian Skelly. I'm the chairman of the Temenos Academy. The Academy, if you don't know, is dedicated really to exploring the beauty and the wisdom of the sacred traditions of the world. And we're certainly going to explore the wisdom of one of those sacred traditions this evening with our speaker. I think it's fair to say that wisdom is not something that you can learn in books, possibly even not learn by trying to write poetry. As that anonymous 9th century Anglo-Saxon poet who wrote The Wanderer said, "No one can be wise before earning their lot of winters in this world." I think it's fair to say that our speaker this evening has earned a few winters, and also with his work as a counsellor and psychotherapist, he has certainly helped a great many people who have been enduring some pretty difficult winters. I've known Nick for probably about 20 years now. About 10 years ago, he took me out for a very nice lunch, and after a bottle or two of wine, persuaded me to become the chairman of the Temenos Academy, handing on the responsibility from him. If you're familiar with the history of the Academy, it was founded by Kathleen Raine, who died and left the Academy in some doubt as to the future. And the administrators at the time, Stephen and Genevieve Overy, certainly worked very hard to get the Academy back on its feet. I've never really felt that it was publicly acknowledged that Nick, as the chairman of Temenos, did a great deal of hard work to keep the Academy going and to enable it to flourish into what it is today. So it's a great pleasure to have him here and to speak about his own work and to hear from someone who really does value what the Academy holds dear. I've got to know Nick's work as well quite recently in the past year or so. I made a couple of films at his request with him. And I have to say that I was absolutely astonished by what he has been achieving of late. I'll leave him to explain what aspects of his work he wants to make public. But when I made one of the films with him, he introduced me to a young lad in New York who I interviewed. And to be quite honest with you, I was blown away by this interview because I thought psychotherapy was something that dealt with the mind, and that's very much a Western outlook on things. And what we're going to hear this evening is that psychotherapy, if you like, or certainly the tradition that Nick is working from, deals with the whole of our experience, body and mind. And for a person like me with very much a Western outlook, the idea that something we call psychotherapy can actually help people with physical illness is something I'm still trying to get my head around. I'm sure by the end of it, I'll have got my head around it because Nick is going to give us, I think, a very fascinating talk. He calls it "The Image Bears Witness to Your State." Would you please welcome Sir Nicholas Pearson.
So, Ian, thank you for your generosity. We had great fun making a film together. I learned lots. He produced a drone out of his pocket and started filming from it, which was a completely new experience for me. Thank you also to Temenos for asking me to give this fifth lecture in the series of the learning of the imagination, which in itself is a title that may stretch some of you, but I hope as we go on through the evening you will consider it reasonable. But most of all, thanks for you for turning up on a sweaty evening to listen to me. I mean, my beloved wife is thrilled to bits I got somebody else to talk to. It's absolutely tremendous. So, thank you. Now, I'm going to start with a poem because I like starting with a poem. And this is a poem that is very beautiful because it really talks about something that others think is not there, which turns out to be there in a sort of way. It's a beautiful, beautiful poem by the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke, and it's about a unicorn. this is a creature that has never been. They never knew it. But even so, they loved the way it moved, its suppleness, its very neck mild, its very look mild and serene. Not there, but because they loved it, it behaved as though it were. They always left some space, and in that clear, unpeopled space they saved, it lightly raised its head with scarce a trace of not being there. They fed it, not with corn, but simply with the possibility of being, and that conferred such strength. Its brow put out a horn. Now, something that in one dimension did not appear to be there, in fact was there in admittedly immaterial form, but it was there due to an act of creative imagination, and that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So you're not going to hear very much of the detail of Iranian Sufism, because I'm not a Muslim and I'm not a Sufi scholar. Neither are you going to hear very much about autoimmune disease, because I leave that to the noble doctors. But the very small ground I stand on with a small confidence, handkerchief-sized, is really contained in this rather enigmatic title: "The image bears witness to your state." And it initially will be a bit of a riddle, but I hope as we go through the evening it'll become a little bit clearer. You could imagine this was a sort of rather interesting intellectual pastime, were it not for the fact that we live in a time when the battle of the image is like heating up in the most concerning way, and people more and more are fed images which do absolutely nothing but diminish their humanity. You just have to think of the sort of games people play online. And so you may find, as we go through this evening, that the image and the root of the root of the root of the image I'm going to talk about is of some interest. Now, I'm going to show you how it was this world of the Sufi tradition of Islam that made me look at this faculty of the imagination again, and indeed involved me in a relearning of the imagination. And it just so happens Temenos is having 6 or 7 lectures on the subject, so I hope I can make some small contribution. So, the adventure we share tonight is to dip our toes into the mystical, magical, imaginative world of the Sufi tradition. And the only reason we really do this is because I think they saw something that we have forgotten. After some 1,500 years of our history, all over the land, week after week, churches are closing. And I'm absolutely not making a religious point here. I'm just saying it's been a fact of our history, and it played its part in shaping the civilization we all have been privileged to live in, with its wonderful openness, its tolerance, and its interest in beauty and courage. So I think as we look at the future, we probably can't ever go back, but we need to be very clear what it is we might be able to carry into the future. Now, my qualifications for talking about this are, to put it mildly, pretty thin. If I have any at all, they lie in the testimonials of those I have been lucky enough to work with in my psychotherapeutic practice. Because it was this tradition of the Sufi world that completely changed the way I work, from being broadly trained as a talking therapist. And I got nothing against talking, but when I discovered this world, I just completely changed. And it was my poor clients who had to bear the relearning of my own imagination. Now, I hope it doesn't sound a slightly grandiose pretension when I say that I do not call my clients clients. I call them fellow travelers because I think we all travel on the same road. None of us know that much. And I see this very much as a collaborative venture. Not always, that's not always possible or appropriate, but wherever possible, I see it as a collaborative venture. Because I prefer the collaborative venture because the power structure can so easily slip into the relationship between those who practice the healing arts and the people who come to them. And one of the lovely things about Sufism was that it was, one of its central ideas was to encourage a sympathy with all beings. I think that's very beautiful. Now, in our Western world, the creative imagination, John, you have very fine seats in the front. Welcome. I bet I've still got hours and hours talking, so you haven't missed much. Now, in our Western world, the creative imagination suffered massive degradation over the last few centuries, until it has really now become a tatter of its former self, degenerating into something that is simply not quite real, imaginary, Walt Disney, fantasy. Of course, useful for the arts, if not essential, and certainly for advertising. But a living, creative connection to the deeper realities of life, I don't think so. Now, I'm going to look at how we might explore this together by talking a little bit about the sources of my inspiration, and then and how our Sufis considered the imagination to be a sacred tool. In their whole system of seeing and vision, rather than a knowledge about things, which we are specialists at. Then I'm practically going to show you how that worked in a case of Parkinson's disease and a case of severe mental trauma, where we had really a total resolution of both cases entirely through the imagination. Because dis-ease of the mind and body is a great place to see yourself more clearly, because when you're threatened, it's like you're paying attention. And I actually discovered that people almost listen to me when they're not very well. Now, I'm going to take about 50 minutes to do that, and then we'll have some questions. I just want to tell you a little digressing question, because I am now going to tell you a little bit about about how I was inspired, what I was inspired by, who I was inspired by, and then a little bit about the Sufi tradition in general. I'm not going into any great depths, but just headline stuff. Anyone who has worked with me and anyone who knows anything about my work will know that one of the archetypes, one of the pillars of the personality that I put tremendous emphasis on and trust in is the child. Whether we know it or not, all of us have this inner reality. The therapy is absolutely alive with the inner child. But a lot of therapy thinks it's to do with memory. I think it's nothing to do with memory. I think it's everything to do with a living presence. So as I was coming here, I thought, God, I haven't actually asked my own inner child what he thinks about the talk. So I got the image up of him, and actually he was far more interested in doing what he was doing. He was not really particularly interested in the talk, but he did say, no, I think the talk's fine. Just don't be boring. And I thought, oh, now that's really good fun. Now, so what are the boring bits? And I had a real think about it. And you know, I came to the conclusion that the sort of boring bits are when you stray from something you actually know. Because we've read lots of books and you've got all this tremendous knowledge. And of course, some of that knowledge is really important and you're going to get it whether you like it or not. But it's just an interesting point that what we actually know about is what we've experienced. So I was really grateful for him. And incidentally, the inner child is a great reality if you're getting old because it keeps you young. It gives you a prod. So let's do the boring bits now, shall we? And then we'll go back into the exciting bits when we get to the case of Parkinson's and so on. So the sources that inspired me were the early Sufi philosophers of roughly 1,000 years ago, from Persia and from the Mediterranean. Many, many of you will know the really marvelous Persian poet Jalaluddin Rumi with his ecstatic his poems of love and praise. And Rumi came out of the ground that was prepared by the two guys I'm going to talk about. The first is a guy called Avicenna. Many of you will not have heard about, and some of you will, because I know there are some Sufi scholars, which makes me rather nervous. And he was around about 980 AD, and then Ibn Arabi, who came about 200 years later, was this great, great figure from Cordoba, when Cordoba was really the center of the intellectual world, about 1160, something like that. Now, we don't revisit these great people to learn about them, so we have more dreaded data on them. We're just trying to see what they actually saw all that time ago that produced for them personally fulfillment, beauty, and interestingly, some sort of spiritual, if I could call it that, fulfillment. You see, they are a type of person in which historical time is really not that relevant. So the fact they're 1,000 years ago is really, really completely irrelevant. Because they fall into a category of person, like Meister Eckhart, like Augustine, like William Blake, and certainly, from my own inspiration, like Carl Jung. And what we're interested in is what they found in their own lives as they lived them, not theoretical stuff, but what they actually found in their actual experience as they stood as human beings between the two opposites of heaven and earth, which we all do, whether we consider it or not. It was Avicenna initially who really grabbed my attention, because he has a very beautiful trilogy of what are called visionary recitals. And the visionary recital is simply a story, a fictional story, that is a spiritual psychological drama that charts the passage of a single soul through the world. Now, I was pretty grabbed by these stories for the very simple reason that they were all about exactly what I face in my consulting room every day. So they may have been 1,000 years ago, but the motifs and the images that came out of them were really no difference at all. So I identified very closely with them. I've lost my place. You see, most psychotherapists and practitioners of the healing arts will know only too well that the best and most effective practice can only possibly be a practice about what they have really learned about themselves. Physician heal thyself is not a bad injunction, which my wife keeps beating me up about as I keep moaning about various things, but it is a very, very important principle to me, because theoretical knowledge and theoretical concepts are of a different order. They may be very valuable, but they are of a different order, and sometimes not quite so effective. Know thyself, written over the Greek temples, they did not write that over their temples for nothing. And I think it's a useful thing for our present time. So that was Avicenna with his visionary recitals, and that really, really got me going. And then there was this giant, this great mystical giant, Ibn Arabi. And it's just worth saying they're trying to establish a chair of Ibn Arabi studies at Oxford. So absolutely fundamental do people think his view of what man really is, and his specific knowledge and deep insights into the nature of man and his relationship through the creative imagination to the heavens. Now, interesting, well, I think it's interesting. He identifies three forms of thought in all of us. Obviously, we have the rational, literal, logical mind, which totally dominates Western societies to a very, very large extent. But as he pointed out, we also have the imaginative, mystical mind, whether we know it or use it or not. And then his third category of thought, which I just love, which I think was a synthesis of the first two, was pure delight. Now, in the West, I think it's a huge claim, but I think it's generally true. The rational, discursive, logical mind has completely flattened the other ways of thinking because it's considered to be more important, more powerful and more real. As individuals, I think we need all three. But out of all this early work I did with studying these two guys, I came out with the liberating idea, well, I found it liberating, that you didn't really need to belong to a religion to tread a hugely meaningful spiritual path through the world. And these guys left me with this idea that if we can break through into an unseen inner world, which is not in its essence religious, but is most profoundly of spirit and soul and realities as human beings, rather than coming from any particular tradition, it's absolutely, I would defend to the last the religions. I'm not poking at them at all. I'm just simply saying that it was the Sufi idea that could see that you didn't really need to have religion. Most Sufis were Muslim, of course. But the sort of significant moments when they really broke through were not actually religious. And this is the world of images we are going into, because those images are not necessarily religious. The churches, of course, have tended to say, well, look, we know what a religious image looks like. Well, I'm not so sure I'm going to agree with them on that. Yes. So who really are the Sufis? Well, they're a 7th century movement essentially from Iran. They spread very rapidly around the Mediterranean. And those of you who know your history will know that 6th, 7th century in Iran, you'd suddenly got the Arabs moving in to what had essentially been a Persian culture with Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism and all these other lovely things. So it was a very turbulent time. And they were called Sufis because they wore woolen jerkins as a mark of their faith. And there's the word tasawwuf, which I think was where the Sufi comes from. It was from day one a esoteric, inward-looking, ecstatic practice, way of looking and viewing the world. It was much, much more a way of seeing things, which is going to be a theme of this talk, of actually seeing things rather than necessarily talking about them. And much more a way of living lives drenched in imagination with their central idea than it was an actual orthodox religion with fixed, literal, dogmatic ideas of faith and belief, which is largely, with many exceptions, what we have today. What impressed me about all this? What simply worked for my practice as a psychotherapist? So to try and give you 3 or 4 points out of that tradition that made really a huge impression on me, I would say the first was the primary nature and the theophanic origins of the imagination and images. I'll come back to the word theophanic in a minute. Because that gave the imagination and the images that arise in all of us a dignity and an importance I never even really considered. And I had been trained essentially as a talking psychotherapist, and when I discovered that, I stopped being a talking psychotherapist. So my wife points out it didn't stop me talking, but it stopped me being a talking psychotherapist. So it absolutely turned it on its head. But to come back to that word theophanic, quite a lot of people who come to work with me don't particularly like the idea of God. That's where we are in our society. Many, I think, tie it up with a religion that they had experienced which wasn't helpful to them or whatever. But I have to deal with that. And all I say to them is this, as I have really said to myself, at this juncture in our history, I think we human beings have to make up our minds. Do we or do we not live within a greater consciousness and a greater intelligence? I don't care what you call it, and most particularly I don't care what we call it, but do we? Is there a wider something going on in the world, or is there not? Because I do think it will, whether the way we answer that question will very much shape how we face the future. The Sufis obviously thought that we did, because for them the imagination had that origin. It came out of that wider consciousness. Indeed, many Sufis thought the presence of the imagination was the presence of the creator, him or herself. And it's so interesting that we humans have this incredible faculty to create. It's in us. We imagine something and then we actually create it. I don't care whether you're an author, you imagine your book and then you create it. You're a chief executive, you imagine your company and then you create it. And so there is that link with the imagination and how they thought about it. So, like, they really thought the imagination had a root, which was a tool that we needed with profound importance. Secondly, I would say the thing that really, and look, it's in the Christian tradition, but it somehow hit me more through this one. The nature of beauty as a theophany. That is to say, that beauty itself suggested the presence of that wider intelligence, wider than the individual human one. Now, here, I'm not just talking about obvious beauty. I'm talking about the astonishing capacity the creative imagination has to turn even the ugly into the beautiful. And we hear echoes of that in our own tradition in William Blake, who says, "For everything that lives is holy." So the importance of the imagination, I absolutely got from this tradition. I love that idea of beauty. I think it's true in many ways. And I think the third thing that is huge for our thinking-orientated Western world is the absolute centrality of the heart as the real place of vision and perception. Now that's a stretch for rationalists, I completely understand it, although it's very interesting that the distinguished neuroscientist from Johns Hopkins, Candice Pert, has said that neuroscience is beginning to understand that the whole construction of what goes on in the heart, which has the same peptides and receptors as the brain, as a central organ of intelligence, is coming through in neuroscience. This was for them the place of vision. It was where stuff happened. And we're going to go into that in a little more detail. But I want you just to listen to Ibn Arabi, to a poem that Ibn Arabi wrote. And remember, Ibn Arabi is a Muslim, but he is obviously completely aware of what were called the peoples of the book, the three, the Abrahamic religions of the Hebrews, the Christians, and the Muslims. And listen what he has to say about his heart. Bang, here. Oh, marvel, a garden among the flames. My heart has become capable of all forms. It is a meadow for gazelles and a monastery for Christian monks. It is a temple for idols and the pilgrim's Kaaba. It is a place for the temple, for the tablets of the Torah and the book of the Quran. For I profess the religion of love, and whatever direction its steed may take, love is my religion and my faith. Now, the level of tolerance in that, and he's talking about a reality that he had created for himself, I think is remarkable. And that leads me on perhaps to the last three quick points about what came out of this tradition, which I then blended into my work. That tolerance is absolutely fundamental to the whole Sufi idea. They were always a great deal more tolerant of other traditions than other traditions were of them. They had the fundamental idea, very much like the Indians in Vedanta, that there was only one life. One life was the reality of the stuff that keeps us all standing up, which we, for all our technological greatness, know absolutely nothing about at all. Call it consciousness, call it anything you like. But there was one life underlying all phenomena, manifesting in myriad different forms, which is part of the delight. So their idea of the unity of religion was not about trying to convert anybody into their religion. It was simply trying to say one thing. Look, whatever religion you're practicing, it doesn't really matter, but whatever you're doing, you're all trying to do the same thing. In their language, you're all trying to see the face of God. And I think that level of tolerance, well, it's certainly not much of it around today, but I think it is a very, very important principle. And it falls in with that sympathy with all being, not just with other human beings, but with all life. Now, alongside tolerance, there were then two fundamental qualities. One was balance, and the other was harmony. Harmony and balance. Now, they were, again, absolutely central to the Sufis, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how the lack of those may manifest in dis-ease. But while we're on the subject, can I just pause for a moment and saying those two, or in fact all the three qualities, tolerance, balance, and harmony, are absolutely fundamental to our patron in Temenos, His Majesty the King, who, with his book on harmony, points out his serious interest in these things. And if I may say so, that beautiful book on harmony was brought to birth by our distinguished chairman, Ian Skelly, who did a most magnificent job. And while we are at that point, may we for a few seconds pray for the health and long life of His Majesty the King, with unceasing thanks from this Academy for his constant encouragement and absolutely genuine interest in the work we try to do. Now, let's get a bit more practical. All this was important to me as I tried to shape a practice from a psychotherapeutic practice, from a practice that I felt, from a tradition that I felt had real wisdom in it. And maybe that required a slightly more mystical, imaginal way of seeing things than pure discursive reason. And I just want to deal with that word mystical for a moment, because pure rationalists have a tendency to dive under the table and look embarrassed when you raise the word mystical. But as Ibn Arabi pointed out earlier on, mystical is just one of our faculties. Whether we use it or not, it's in there. And I think our medieval England, of course, was absolutely full of it, absolutely full of it. So, in order to, yes, what I was really trying to say was that the mystical is simply a tool. We look at a fact that is, to me, absolutely obvious, which is that we still live in a mystery. There is still much about all our lives that is deeply, for all our clever technology and science, is still absolutely a mystery, just that. And the faculty that needs to look at that is that imaginative, imaginal, mysterious, mystical faculty we all have. Now, yeah, so in order to carry you along on this little adventure, and I'm about to take you through this case of Parkinson's, I want to show you what I actually mean by an image, what I actually mean by the imagination. Because our world is full of images. It could be pictures, it could be all sorts of things. And so I want to actually, so I'm going to get you to go inside into your inner worlds, a place, if I may say so, we have largely forgotten. And there I'm going to get you to find an image, completely harmless. Don't worry, this is not going to cause multiple nervous breakdowns in here, so you can all relax. But I want you to see if you can see, rather than think about, what on earth I'm talking about. So I'm going to get you to close your eyes, and then I'm going to get you to use your imagination. So if you could all just quietly close your eyes. And it would be really helpful if you could just watch, with your eyes closed, the chest rising and falling. Now, most of you, if you can't, don't worry, but most of you will be able to see your chest rising and falling. And that's pretty interesting because you've got your eyes closed. So there you are looking at a new faculty, again, which is incredibly important when healing yourself, of pure awareness. You're just aware your chest is rising and falling. And you're most particularly, well, a lot of you are probably thinking as well, but at least see the difference between thinking and being aware that your chest is rising and falling. Now, as well as the awareness of your chest rising and falling, invite into the room the sound of silence. Now, with your awareness in the heart, in the chest, I'm just going to ask you to imagine something. And the thing I want you to imagine is a house. Okay, so most of you will now be looking at a house. It may be a house you know, it may be a house you don't know. It doesn't matter, it's a house, so look at it. And just note, if you go, before you go into it, which I'm going to ask you to do, is it the sort of house you'd like to live in? And what I want you to do now is to go inside it. Go straight through the front door and go and stand silently inside this imaginal house of yours. And just notice, what is the atmosphere in this house? What's it like for you being inside this house? And notice, maybe if it's a bit dusty or grubby or it needs a lick of paint or something, what could you do to improve it? And then when you're ready, leave by the front door and open your eyes. Now, I gave you a thought. I said, imagine a house. And you used that thought, and with that thought, you produced an image. I don't think many of you will have consciously produced it. It'll have just popped up. Now, there's an image, but the image is much more, because the image is much more than just a sort of flat image. It's a symbol. Because we find we can go into it and experience something. And clearly the house is not there, but you went in. And I don't know, some of you would have found that it was welcoming, warm. Some of you would have found it was a bit cold. Some of you would have found it was a bit empty. Some of you would have found... But this tells us really something interesting about how you live your lives. And I'm not going to go into that because we haven't got time for 100 cases. But it's like, it's up to you to note what actually happened there. Because when we go into our case of Parkinson's, we're going to do exactly the same thing. But we're going to look at what this disease looks like rather than talk about it. So the only thing I really want you to learn out of that was you had a thought, you created an image, but the image sort of is quite interesting. It would have told you something. And if we'd pressed on in there, we could have met all sorts of very interesting figures which would have told you an enormous amount about your inner world. So there you are. That's that. Now, before I show you this case of Parkinson's, just one more principle. Anybody who comes to work with me, we separate out their personal map into two sides. Because whether we like it or whether we don't, we have a sort of genuinely positive side which we put to the world, and we have this other side, this rather darker side, which we don't particularly want our friends to see, but from where all the trouble comes, all of it, as far as I'm concerned, very rarely out of the bright, shiny side. And so you'll see in a minute how, as I enter this case of Parkinson's, I get him, I'm not pushing him in any direction at all, how he describes himself in this way. So these two sides tend to stand in sort of opposition to each other. So, for example, if you have massive ambition on one side, you're sure as anything going to have a terror of failure on the other. And if on this left-hand side you have a feeling of not being good enough, it'll probably show up on this side as a desire for some sort of perfection. So they compensate each other with deadly accuracy. And in the Western world, we tend just to concentrate on the bright, shiny side. And the real problem is well, the problem and the wonder is on the left side. Now, my splendid fellow traveller of Parkinson's, who's very happy to discuss his case and is on podcasts talking about it and all the rest of it, is a splendid ex-services 73-year-old. He's had Parkinson's for 3 years. He had lost control of his right arm, and this meant he couldn't play his beloved violin, which is really a very important part of his life. But even worse, he was beginning, the muscles around his throat and neck were beginning to close in on him, and he was finding it very difficult even to swallow his medication, and his talking was becoming bad, and he was beginning to make a mess of his food all over his face and so on. So he was not in a great way. But of course, worst of all, as this thing was closing in on him, he got terribly depressed and felt trapped and was very unhappy. So step one, session one, I get him to describe the two sides of his nature. In his view, not in mine, in his view. Can we see that here? So here you can see how he describes himself. On the positive side, he describes himself as he loves his family and he loves his music. He loves nature. He's a creative guy. That's how he describes himself. That's fine. Now, if we turn onto the left, the more negative, the more inferior side, he describes himself as having a great fear of losing control, and a desire to constrain, denigrate in some way, hold back, some form of sort of self-hatred, and of course the usual inertia, anger, and of course fear. So that's how my fellow traveller actually describes himself. No coaching from me, but what we're now going to do is we're going to see if he can find an image of what that actually looks like. Rather than thinking and talking about it, we're going to see if the creative imagination will produce an image of, just exactly as I did with your house. I gave you a thought, it produced an image, and the image had information in it. Well, we're going to do this with his dis-ease. So I take him in and I set him up in a field with two sides to it, basically. And I get him to look into the right-hand side, which is the sort of positive side. And he immediately gets an image of himself. And it's summer, and he looks healthy, he's moving pretty well, and he's singing. So a good positive image of himself, nothing to worry about there. And then I take him into the left-hand side of the field, and bang, he immediately gets an image of himself in a wheelchair, effectively crippled. Very significantly, he describes it as he seems to be constrained in his wheelchair. Something is like holding him there. And he's not happy, and his violin is on the ground. So there he is looking at the negative image of himself. Now we have got the wherewithal to actually work with this, because he has become an observer of himself. He has an image with himself and his dis-ease. So my technique would be to say to him, why do you think this guy is in the wheelchair? What sense do you get of why he's there? And he said, well, it's as if something's holding him in that wheelchair, which I think is significant. And I then ask him and say, so what do you think might help him? What does he need to get out of this wheelchair? He thinks about it for a moment. He said, I don't know. I don't know, possibly some reassurance. So I said, okay, well, give him some reassurance. Give him some emotional reassurance. Give the image some emotional reassurance. See how that works. Oh, he's smiling. Now, here we are. We're now in a dynamic situation between he, the observer, and the image. The image is smiling in reaction to that more sympathetic view of himself. And I then had borne in mind this word constrained. And I said to him, you get a sense that this guy is constrained in his wheelchair. Is that anything to do with the feelings around the muscles of your neck and throat? No hesitation at all, he says exactly the same. So we have a connection. We have a connection between an imaginally crippled side of himself and the feelings of tension in the throat and neck. Now, I work with this over probably 3 sessions with him, and he develops a lovely little way of working every morning. He flips onto his back in bed, he does some breathing exercise to relax himself, and then he starts reassuring the crippled image. And he emailed me quite quickly after this to say, I do it every morning, I'm giving him lots of tender loving care, and he's beginning to respond, and I think he'll be out of his wheelchair quite soon. Now, he got out of his wheelchair. So that was a tremendously effective way of working. And I give you his testimonial, not to show you how clever I am, but simply to validate that this is a really useful way of taking a different approach to this particular disease. I'm sure it doesn't work in all of them, but in this particular disease. So he said, he writes, and he's on podcasts and things saying the same thing, and he's very happy for us to do this. He said, I had 3 sessions and a couple of Zooms with Nick, and he showed me a whole new approach to my disease, and I think that really is the crux line. Nick believed the underlying lifetime stress brought about by an excessive desire to control everything lay behind the whole condition, and I'm beginning to see this could be true. I'm happy to say it's working by learning to release the tight stressed muscles around my throat and neck, by being nicer to the crippled image of myself. My swallowing and talking has improved. Breathing exercises every day mean I've been able to start proper walking again, and best of all, my music making has become possible. Of course, it's a long journey, but it's a wonderful start in such a short space of time, and at 73, I can face life again with renewed energy, less anxiety, and hope. So I hope that gives you some idea of what I mean by working with images, and how the image can, as the title of the talk says, bear witness to the state you may find yourself in, and how we may then work with that, with the creative imagination, to bring about real change. I've had some good experience with conditions like fibromyalgia, fibroids, endometriosis, where there's no pathogens, no virus involved. I don't understand viruses, so I can't do that. But where I think there's a serious underlying stress condition, I think we can undo. I think images are fantastically helpful in undoing that particular structure. Of course, not always and not for everyone. Sometimes there's just too much fear, too much blackening anger, too much hard work, conditioning. Somebody is really conditioned to think in a particular way. It can be quite hard to shift. And I would have to add sometimes just too much super powerful medication. And sometimes, of course, I simply get it wrong. I have lots of failures and inconclusive adventures to keep my feet firmly on the ground, but enough of the other truly joyful stuff for the general direction of travel to be in no doubt as far as I'm concerned. Now let's just back up and look at this a little bit in a slightly wider sense, this use of the creative imagination. From roughly the 17th century came the rise of scientific thinking, pure rational thought with its very high bar of material proof required to validate any given reality. This form of thought, of thinking, largely detached itself from the old spiritual beliefs of the previous medieval centuries. Now, of course, there were huge material benefits for this, but they do seem to be curiously two-sided. We learnt to fly, but we now have intercontinental ballistic missiles. We learnt to control child births, but we now have overpopulation. We've got enormous choice, pleasure, and comfort, but we seem to be doing the planet irreparable harm. Now, the sort of rational scientific thinking that got us here, in its ascendancy, unbalanced, undermined the whole basis of all those spiritual and imaginatively creative practices of church and state, by simply denouncing the central component of all of them, the imagination, as not being real, as being just imaginary. Whole spiritual cosmologies built on this imaginal way of seeing and living life all over the world collapsed and are collapsing, with consequences no one in their right mind can possibly consider to be wholly beneficial. Can you actually imagine, in the last 1,000 years or so, anywhere on the planet, any of the great religious or spiritual festivals that brought the whole populations together taking place without the creative imagination at its central core? Why have we stopped imagining these wider worlds? Perhaps because we are conditioned to think they're simply not real, imaginary. What, after all, is a high mass to a Christian? What is the festival of Diwali to an Indian, or the sacred sun dance of the American Plains Indians, or even the Hajj, if it is not an act of pure creative imagination? Imagination at its most potent and most relevant and its most valuable to our sense of what on earth we are all doing here. The mystical imaginal does not mean you have to be a cloistered monk or a priest. It should not and surely must not stop you being a good lawyer or a great carpenter or an effective and compassionate statesman or a great hip-hop artist. Surely we need all forms of human thought that are in our capacity, the rational and the mystical balancing each other out. But I make the point again, because I think for our century it's important. This mystical way of seeing things does not have to be religious. It can be, but it doesn't have to be religious. It's simply a human spiritual faculty. And the Dalai Lama, who is, I think, wonderfully wise about looking to the future and how we must be prepared to change, he himself admits that most people can probably live perfectly well without religion. What they cannot live without, if they're to make sense of their lives, is some sort of practice and attachment to spiritual values. Now, let's see if we can see and get an idea of why the Sufis were so convinced that the creative imagination came from a wider reality, a wider form of consciousness than our own small individual one. So what the spiritual basis for their view of the imagination actually came from. You see, the Sufi genius perceived an intermediate world between heaven and earth, a sort of Clapham Junction, if you will, an actual place you can get into in a state of inward awareness and reflection, a place where you can change trains from the material to the immaterial, change from the material world of the five senses to the psycho-spiritual immaterial world of apparitions, shadowy immaterial presences of a decidedly different order that still have the power to curse or bless us. Few would argue that we have the capacity to be angels or demons. They called this place, the Alam al-Mithral, the world of images. And the place was, for them, the place where two differing sorts of realities met. It was located inside us, inside the human heart, never in the head, which is why pure reason, it cannot really be approached with pure reason. This, for the Sufis, was true reality, the root of the root of the root of all things, a place of vision, a place of seeing rather than thinking about, a way of seeing into this other spiritual reality of the wider intelligence, a place of spirits, a place of theophanies. Now, we get glimpses of this world in the dreams of the fellow travelers that come to work with me, of a whole world of universal archetypal images and symbols in this way of looking. And they come into sight in this way of looking. Crosses, circles, crescents, squares, rising and dying, putrefaction and healing, creation and destruction, birth and death. It is in this inner world you may find intimations of spirit as light, of the soul as a winged being, as it has been since the time of Plato. In this tradition, the idea of soul often clusters around winged images. I would love to say more about this, but time is at my heels. But I should just say, I cannot say it's common to come across these images and symbols, but let's just say it's not uncommon either. And anyone who has turned a single page of Carl Jung's Red Book will know exactly what I'm talking about. I think if you reflect on the images he recorded from his own experience and his own life in traveling in these realms, I think anyone would be profoundly touched and thoughtful as to the spiritual possibilities of our world. The creative imagination is the only vehicle that can possibly take us into these worlds, which are sometimes inspiring and sometimes frightening. Some of you may remember that Carl Jung, asked at the end of his life if he believed there was a God, famously replied, "No, I do not believe. I know." That, I think, is the fruit of this journey into the world of images. Now, we have talked of spirits and souls, imagination and images. We have drifted high and inevitably inadequately across the general ground of the world of the Sufi tradition. Before I close and try somewhat nervously to answer your questions, I want to share with you a case, the sort of which any therapist might face in a week's work. This case is about the archetypal image of the child, an image we all carry in us, an image that incidentally lies at the heart of the Christian story, but I think for our age lies even closer to ourselves, deep in us. The story, this case is about how a rejected, unlived, traumatized child may become a monster to others, but often only to itself. It's about how sometimes we may redeem that awful, tragic fact of life with a learning of the imagination we have been talking about. So, to Sinead, my fellow traveller of the Celtic blood, a name that warmed me, for in the Gaelic it means God is gracious, and what's wrong with that? It's not her name, of course, but she so badly wanted me to use her case to share the beauty of what we did together. She's in her 40s, she passionately wants to know the who and the why of her place here on earth. She had a bucket full of problems, and her path was strewn with the usual dragons of exhaustion, despair, rage, and a terrible shame, toxic shame, and self-hatred at who she had become. Really painful stuff if you've never experienced it yourself. And you know, no injunction to settle down and get a good job and just shut up is going to tackle this sort of agony. I don't go back to talk about the past, churning up old memories. I never found that particularly useful myself, and it just kept me in therapy for far, far longer than was necessary. Whatever happened to my fellow traveller Sinead is sitting there right in front of me, rather obviously. So let's deal with it in the present moment whatever it is and however it got there, without blaming anybody. Let's see if we can use our creative imagination to find an image of what all that long, desperate, angry life has come to look like in her. See if we can find an image that bears witness to her state, and then see if we can work with that image to change her state. This, I believe, we can do. We start, and then we don't speak for a few days, but she mails me with the gift of a beautiful, big dream. She says after this dream that she's all over the place. I can hear the doubt in her voice about the way we're working, because, of course, this way of seeing and looking is completely new to her. In the dream, she is Hitler's daughter. There is then a whole litany of physical abuse in the dream image. She's thrown against a wall repeatedly. She sees her face in the dream as puffy and battered. There are guns and knives all over, symbols of the great fury and violence she suffered and has now turned against herself. My impassioned mantra, in almost all the cases I see, as you were treated, so you will treat yourself, seems again to be true, as does the stricture I have become very keen on, blame no one. I get her on a Zoom line as soon as I can, and we go straight back into the dream image to see if we can find that ruthless, authoritarian, violent part of herself as presented in the dream image as Hitler. She finds him, but not as she or I expects. He's on the floor, rigid, contorted with the agony of his rage. Absolutely rigid, immovable. I ask her what she wants to do with this image lying on the floor. She says she feels she wants to vomit. She's always a sign of a big emotion she wants to get rid of and clearly hasn't done up to now. But most of all, she wants to have nothing to do with the image whatsoever, hates him far too much, makes her feel sick, which gives you a little bit of an idea of how much she hates herself. So we seem stuck. But I know that stuck as we seem, we must now just contemplate the gift of the image until the image itself is ready to reveal the transforming power of its gift. The clever, thinking, rational mind, longing for clever interpretations and solutions, is going to be absolutely no help here. We must be humble enough to contemplate and wait. The minutes tick by, and then, to me, what seems like a miracle. She says, there seems to be a very small and very vulnerable 9-month-old baby in the corner of the room. I ask her what she wants to do with it. I have no ideas. But the instinct in her is to pick the child up and hold it and rock it in her arms. Her face visibly softens as she begins to connect with that part of herself. I gently suggest that she tries to look into the child's eyes. I am hoping this will generate a deep connection with part of herself that she has cut herself off from previously. And she says, quite matter-of-factly, eyes like the deep, deep blue sea. And she adds, and she's smiling at me. There's then a pause, and rather wistfully, she adds, no eyes ever looked at me like that before. There's then another long pause, and she says, I'm holding her on my chest, and it feels really good. And I say rather annoyingly, and I come to think of it, what sort of good? And she says, tender. I feel myself melting. She sends me an email the next day. I reconnected to the child a couple of times today while on the move, whenever anger or fear swelled up inside me. I felt the most capable and capacious yet. And I'm sort of amazed and just letting the feelings integrate without worrying too much about it all. I felt and I feel the beauty of energy transforming. Thank you. Thank you. Incidentally, I had an email from her 6 weeks after this, and she says she's in a completely different place and the anger has gone. Now, I hope these stories and these images touch you somewhere. Where do these images and the symbols they represent, where do they come from? How is it that they seem so capable of transforming energy? I shall leave that to your imagination. Thank you.
Well, Nick, thank you very much for that very revealing talk. And lots of ideas are flying around my mind, as I'm sure they're flying around yours. One in particular is just this, the importance of awareness, as you pointed out. And you mentioned the king. I was recently interviewed for a television documentary about my work with him. And the interviewer asked me eventually, when I was explaining what he tried to do 40 years ago and all his different ideas, this interviewer said to me, where do you think this came from, all this? It almost seems as if it was intuitive. And I said, yes. And we then got into this very long conversation about the word intuitive and the intuition. He had no concept that it's a faculty.
Yeah.
And I think this is exactly what you're saying here, that we have lost sense of that other half of us, which is the faculty of intuition, the faculty of awareness. And I think that's one of the most revealing things that I've come to understand from your work, that to bring that back into the fold is what we not just have to do in a therapy room, but perhaps in our own lives and in the wider world at large. We do have time for some questions, if anyone's still awake. Who would like to start?
Well, it's just you mentioned that you wanted something. You mentioned about cells, but there isn't time to talk about that. Is there time to mention some little thing?
I think it's just worth saying, in this tradition, the soul was absolutely central to the tradition, and it was seen and experienced as a winged being. And this has been happening since the time of Plato. Plato's soul was a winged charioteer. Now, the interesting thing about modern therapy, and look here, oh no, we haven't got it, but the wonderful thing you came into, the Conference of the Birds. In the Persian tradition, 3 great works: the Conference of the Birds by the poet Hafez, the Recital of the Birds by Avicenna, and Gabriel's Wing by the Sufi poet Surawadi. So the wing was again, look at our medieval paintings, and look at the wings in them. And we, of course, all that's gone because we're now scientific and we don't sort of nonsense. Well, actually, sorry, but the wing is still there. I come across it in my fellow travelers very often tragically, because to the Sufis, the whole point about the soul was it came many times. And maybe this was the basis of people's idea about many lives, many incarnations. And its job was to bring the person to perfection. But what happened to it, once it got into matter, it got bogged down in all sorts of lovely things like sort of, roast beef and claret and whatever the other things are. And it forgets that its real job is to soar. So I find in the dreams of the people I work with broken wings very often. Even had one tragic case of wings that had been ripped out of the body, and this particular guy was in terrible trouble. Soul, really important as an image, not as a concept. I mean, I could tell you the Sufi concept of the soul. It had 3 stages. It had the basic first lower self stage, and then it had the complaining soul, which said, no, I don't like what's going on around here. And then eventually you got to the soul, the accepting soul, who could return to his Lord, accepting and accepted, which is rather beautiful. But that's words and theory, but I like the images.
Yes, over there. The microphone coming.
I thought it was so interesting in the first image that you tried to get your patient to, as it were, self-interview. You asked him, I think, to imagine 2 fields. You addressing one side of the mind with the other, the creative,
Correct.
the rational. Is that normally the way in? Because I noticed in the last image that you asked the person to conjure up, it was a single image. Do you often break it up into a sort of fractal?
No, to be honest, with the last case, I absolutely took her into that field to begin with. But I didn't, I was short of time. But the field is just a device. The really important thing, which Ian pointed out, is to enter this state of awareness. Now, we're all driven crazy by this thing. We overthink everything. Everybody's actually going mad thinking so much. And I think our original innocence is somewhere in this place of pure awareness. Because you stop the thinking mind and you just become aware of yourself and the breath and the heart and the silence and the stillness and the emptiness. And that's the door into pure being. Then you've got another door, which is thinking and doing. That's fine. But boy, you need a rest. I think all those people need a rest.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. As you were talking, various things came into my mind or my awareness. One was the Sacred Heart, which is in the Catholic tradition.
Absolutely.
Has gone out of the window now because you can't have statues and you can't have all that
Has it been
rubbish.
chucked out?
A lot of people have chucked it out.
Really? Yeah.
But I
tragic.
was very heartened by Pope Leo, our new Pope, and he said we can learn a lot from the Eastern Christian tradition, which has got the mystical, the symbolism, the ritual,
Yeah.
whereas after Vatican II, we went very much more literal. It's
Yes,
almost like the Mass has
exactly.
become a community meeting. Yeah.
Thank you. Because you see, that is what, and I'm not criticizing anybody, but what's tended to happen is that with the removal of imagination, and I put it that way rather than the doctrine, to me the doctrine and the way we believe comes from the imagination. And so that's the central tool. And the dogmatic phase tended to become more literal, more historical, more this is the way it is, and losing that wonderful imaginative side. Pray to your Lord as if you could see him. But from the Council of Nicaea, pretty much onwards, the Christian church said, look, there's stuff you can believe and stuff, the images you can accept and images you can't. I find, and I've been doing this for 30 years, I've yet to find an image that we can't deal with, put it that way.
I'm also a psychotherapist.
Oh, yes.
So I'm listening to you very carefully.
Okay.
A couple more questions. There's one at the back there, and then we'll come
Question.
to you in just a second. Oh, either way.
Hi, thank you for that. I'm wondering about children. I'm wondering about children in the Sufi tradition, actually. Children, obviously, childhood changes and evolves and is one thing now and was something different, 100 years ago. I'm wondering about children either in the Sufi tradition, in the sense of spirituality, And also in your work, if you've worked with children and what age, it feels like this is something that they would obviously have innately, we all have. But do you ever work with children, and what age do you feel like you could take a child into the imagination in that way without interfering? Or...
It's interesting. And I have to admit to a certain ignorance here. I mean, I've worked and am working with 14 and 15-year-olds, but not with young children. Now, because for me, the central act for the child, of 14 or 15, is to visualize the child. Because they immediately want to look after it and have it with them. It's just instantly. I mean, you know, the grown-ups are much harder. It's really, really difficult. So what happens between 0 and 14? I'm not the person to ask, unfortunately, Charlotte. But as I say, I have actually worked with a 12-year-old, which was brilliantly successful. She was just absolutely wonderful. She knew exactly what it was all about.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
I don't think it should be disputed or ignored, the fact that when you deal with small children, they live in their imagination.
Totally.
There is no separation between the two. And the myth of leaving the garden is a very powerful one, I think, and that you're leaving your imagination. That's the warning, possibly.
Back into this dance.
Yeah. There was another question.
Hi. Thank you, Nick. That was fascinating. Just a really practical question. I heard you say a couple of times, I jumped on a Zoom, and then you continued a conversation with the person you were working with. I just wondered, for the creation of the image work, do you have any kind of sense that your intuition or your preference for working face-to-face or through a screen, does it make much difference? As a practitioner, I feel that it makes a big difference to me.
I mean, my sort of golden rule has got to meet once. And I've ignored that in 2 or 3 cases recently. And the cancer case that he and I did on film, I never met the guy until he was clear, and then he visited. He was in New York, and my instinct is the same as yours. It's like different if we can get, particularly where the body is concerned, and you're talking about an autoimmune problem, you need to be able to see in detail how they react in the body. Because the usual tendency is to go straight into the mind and start thinking about the wretched disease. You've got to keep them in the body, because that's where the feeling is that is probably behind the disease. Yeah.
One more question, perhaps, here on the front here, yes.
I just want to say that as a Muslim, in the Quran, when we refer to the heart, it actually is the place that captures the mind, the soul, and everything, and it has a memory of its own.
Has an energy of its own.
Memory.
Energy and a memory.
An enemy of its own.
A memory.
Sorry?
Memory. So it's very important when we say the word qalb, it actually is the combination of all that. So when you talk about the heart, it's very true that it does control everything that is around us. And it is specifically written in the Quran.
No, it's lovely. It's lovely. But I take you back to the Sufi principle of total tolerance. The Quran does it one way and they do it magnificently. And I think actually the practice of zikr in the heart is one of the most powerful things. Zikr is this wonderful device of the chanting of the names of God, la ilaha illallah, and you just keep doing it again and again and again, and it builds up tremendous energy in the heart. It's called himma, and it's a real force, and most of us tired Europeans can't do it.
Well, there we are. I think we've got plenty of food for thought, Nick. Thank you very much for your wonderful, illuminating talk, which is more an explanation of your own experience and your own journey. And may you long carry on the path. Thank you very much.
Thank you.